So user input validation is an important topic. For example, at the moment, I can create a new place and simply leave out the title, share an empty field. And if I send this, it creates a new place with an empty title. I certainly don't want that. I want to validate the data I get on the incoming request and actually send back an error if it doesn't match my expectations. To implement validation, I'll use a third-party library, Express Validator. I'll use that because manually validating it here with if checks, where I check if title, once we trim it, to remove excess white space, if the length is empty, in which case I send back an error. Doing all that is possible, but very cumbersome. I don't want to write dozens of if checks to check different conditions. Instead, this library will make it easier. It's built for Express. It gives us middlewares that we can register to run various validations on the incoming data. You can learn all about this package on this page here, on their official documentation. But of course, here I will also show you some of the most important features. Now, most importantly, we need to install it. So let's stop that running server and run npm install -- save, because it is a dependency we need in our code, express-validator, and hit enter, and this will now install this third-party package into your project. And thereafter, you can restart npm start. Now we can add validation, and the first step for that is actually in your routes file, here in places routes. There, I have two routes where I want to validate the input, and that are my post and my patch routes. I don't need to validate these parameters here, because if an invalid ID is passed here, I'm simply not able to identify data, and we're already sending back an error response in that case already. So I only need to care about post and patch here. There, I want to make sure that the data which is in the request body, and that is what it's really all about, I want to validate my request body data, if that is valid. So how does this package work? Well, first of all, we need to import it. We import it, but we import it a bit differently with object destructuring. I require Express Validator here, and I could simply import it all into one object. Validator, for example, that would work. But here, I actually only need one specific method. So I will use object destructuring and import the check method. By the way, we could have done something similar here for Express Router. I could have implemented just router like this and called it like that down there. That would also work, and that's basically what I'm doing here. I'm mixing these syntaxes also to show them both. This is regular JavaScript syntax in the end. So we need the check method here. Now, the check method actually is a method or a function we can execute, and it will return a new middleware configured for our validation requirements. Now, we need it here, for example, on this post request. Now, one thing I haven't taught you thus far is that when you register a middleware like this, you actually always have this filter, this path here as the first argument, but thereafter you're not limited to one middleware. You can register multiple middlewares on the same HTTP method path combination, and they will simply be executed from left to right here in your arguments. So here, I want to add a new middleware, a new parameter, a new argument I pass to this method call, which will be this check function. Now here, we execute it. We don't just point at it. Instead, we execute it, and check then takes the name of the field in your request body which you want to validate. So in my case, for example, the title field. Now it will return a new middleware function which is then registered here and which is then executed by Express. But this middleware function now needs to be configured, you could say. Right now I'm saying I want to check the title, but I'm not saying how I want to check it. Well, I want to ensure that it's not empty. That is my requirement here. For that, we can chain various methods on the result of this check method. For example, the isEmpty method. This overall returns a middleware, which is given to Express, so to say, which checks for title to be empty. Now, I want the opposite. I want that it's not empty. And conveniently, there is a not method you can chain in between. And this reads like plain English in the end, right? We check that the title is not empty. And that overall gives us a new middleware, which is added for post requests that target /API/places/nothing. And it will run before our controller runs. Now, it's not the only check I want to perform, so I will add more middleware. And instead of adding multiple arguments, we can also group that together into an array. We could add multiple arguments, but I want to make it clear that all these middlewares belong together, so to say. They're all related to validation. And I want to check the description here as well. I want to check that description is of a specific length. Now, this takes an argument where I configure this with an object I pass to isLength. And there we can set a max length and, interesting for me here, a min length of 5 characters. This automatically means that it must not be empty, but not being empty is not enough. It also needs to have at least 5 characters. I also want to check the address. And for the address, I want to check that it's not empty, because I'm not sure, maybe we do have a valid address that's only 1 character long, so it should just not be empty. Now, I will not validate the coordinates, because later we will not get them from the client anyways. Instead, later I will add a function here on the server where I reach out to a Google API and translate the address which I get to coordinates, and if that fails, I throw an error here on the server. We'll do this a little bit later, so for the moment, let's just focus on this validation here. Now, that's the validation for creating a new place. If we now save that, we can give it a try. Let's try create a new place where the title is empty. It still works. So what did we do wrong? Well, actually, Express Validator consists of 2 parts. You register this middleware, but this alone does not return an error. Instead, now you have to go to your controller, so to the middleware function which is executed upon your incoming request. And then there you need to add something as well. You need to import something from that Express Validator package. And again, I will use object destructuring to import just what I need. Here we need the validation result function. Then in the middleware functions, which are triggered upon your routes that have validation added to them, right at the beginning, you can call validation result as a function and pass the request object to it. And now what this function will do is it will look into this request object and see if there are any validation errors which were detected based on your setup here. So this will return you an errors object, so to say. Now this object has a method isEmpty, which you can call. And if this is not true, we know it's not empty, which means we do have errors. And in this case, we can throw a new HTTP error where we say invalid inputs passed, please check your data, and add a status code of 422. Now, actually, this errors object has a bit more data, which is why I'll log it here. And you could also attach this to a response. You could send a response here with a status code of 422. And for example, not just add your message, but also more details about the errors if you wanted to. Here, I'll go with the default error handling and just send this generic response message here. So with that, if we now save this and we try creating this again, now it fails. We get this error and the 422 error code. And indeed here now in the console, we see some output. We have this errors object, and in there we have detailed information about the errors. We see that for the title field, we had an invalid value. Now you can configure this in more detail if you wanted to, and the official docs of Express Validator are the place to go to learn how to add your own error messages and so on. So that's something you can do. I'm happy with this basic validation we have here, but of course I also want to add it to this patch request. And that is a great challenge for you, not just for the patch request, but also for the user routes. And there, think about which routes really need validation, and then come up with some validation rules that make sense to you. Also have a look at the official documentation here to find out how you can validate. And in the next lecture, we'll implement all these validation steps together.